The heavy oak doors of the downtown courthouse creaked open, letting in a stream of people who carried with them a mixture of nerves, curiosity, and tension. Reporters stood near the entrance, whispering among themselves, notebooks and cameras ready. They were here for one reason, the case that had captured the attention of nearly everyone in the city. A man, accused of a serious crime, was about to face the verdict of the justice system. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. The walls, lined with dark wood panels, seemed to close in around those who waited. The benches creaked as people settled into their seats. Some whispered about the evidence. Others speculated about what the jury might decide. It was no ordinary trial. For weeks, headlines had screamed about the accused, his name, his alleged actions, his supposed guilt. To most, the outcome already felt decided. At the defense table sat the man at the center of it all. His suit was pressed, but looked borrowed, as though someone else had chosen it for him. His eyes, dark and weary, scanned the courtroom nervously. He seemed less like a monster, as the newspapers painted him, and more like someone trapped in a storm too powerful to escape. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale from pressure. Though surrounded by people, he looked achingly alone. The prosecutor, confident and composed, flipped through a stack of papers. She wore her authority like armor, her tone sharp with the conviction of someone who believed the truth was firmly on her side. To her, this was supposed to be straightforward, a case, sealed with witness testimonies, evidence collected, and trust in the system. She glanced briefly at the defense attorney, a man known for his tenacity, though even he seemed unsure of what thread he might pull to unravel the prosecution's fabric. The jury entered in silence, their faces carefully neutral. 12 strangers tasked with deciding the fate of another human being, yet each of them carried private doubts, fears, and biases. Some stole glances at the accused, others avoided his gaze entirely. It was impossible to know what conclusions were already forming behind their eyes. At the far side of the room, families sat together. Some were relatives of the accused, clutching each other's hands tightly, praying for mercy. Others were victims' families, eyes filled with anger and hope for justice. The tension between them was unspoken but palpable, as though a thin wire stretched across the benches, threatening to snap at any moment. Among the spectators, a young mother quietly entered, holding the hand of her 3-year-old daughter. The little girl clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, its fur faded from years of love. She looked too small, too fragile for a place like this. Her wide eyes scanned the courtroom, curious but unafraid, as though the seriousness of the setting hadn't yet reached her tender understanding of the world. Some spectators frowned when they noticed her. What business did a toddler have in a courtroom? Others barely gave her a glance, assuming she was simply there because her mother had no choice but to bring her along. But her presence would soon prove to be anything but ordinary. The judge, a stern man with decades of cases behind him, entered and took his seat. His gavel struck the block, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the crowd. His expression was unreadable, carved into the same seriousness he wore every day. "This court is now in session," he announced, his deep voice echoing across the chamber. The trial began with routine proceedings. Witnesses were called, documents entered into evidence, statements made. The process was methodical, almost mechanical. Lawyers sparred with carefully chosen words, each move calculated, each objection strategic. The rhythm of the courtroom was familiar, and to most, predictable. Yet there was something in the air that day, a subtle unease, like the quiet before a storm. It wasn't obvious to everyone, but a few noticed it. The defense attorney sensed it in the prosecutor's overconfidence. A reporter scribbling notes at the back of the room felt it in the restless shifting of the jury. And the little girl, though too young to understand the weight of justice, felt it in her bones. Children often did. The girl sat quietly beside her mother, swinging her legs. She watched the people in uniforms, the men and women in suits, the large wooden desk where the judge sat. To her, the courtroom wasn't intimidating. It was strange, almost like a stage where everyone played a part. Her stuffed rabbit sat on her lap, ears flopping to one side, as if listening to the proceedings with equal curiosity. At one point, the defense attorney mentioned her name, surprising the courtroom. Heads turned. The mother stiffened, holding her daughter's hand tighter. The judge raised his brows. A child witness? The notion seemed absurd. The prosecutor frowned, certain it was a desperate ploy. What could a 3-year-old possibly contribute? Whispers spread across the benches like wildfire. A child? One man muttered. She can't even form sentences properly. Another woman whispered. The mother looked nervous, but the attorney's tone was calm, confident. He wasn't about to call her for a full testimony, not yet, but her presence mattered. Somehow, he believed she carried a truth others had overlooked. The judge allowed a short recess before proceeding, giving everyone a moment to breathe. The jury stretched, the lawyers whispered among themselves, and the officer with the police dog adjusted his uniform. The K9, a large German shepherd, sat obediently at his side, its ears perked, eyes scanning the room with sharp awareness. Most people ignored the animal. It was a symbol of discipline, of authority, a silent enforcer of order. But the little girl's eyes locked on the dog, her expression changing ever so slightly. She leaned against her mother and whispered something inaudible, clutching her stuffed toy tighter. Her gaze didn't waver from the dog. No one noticed her quiet focus, not yet. The recess ended. The gavel struck again. The trial moved forward. But beneath the surface of routine, the day was quietly building towards something extraordinary. A revelation was waiting, and it would not come from lawyers, or the judge, or the jury. It would come from the smallest person in the room, the one no one thought mattered. The courtroom, heavy with formality and law, was about to be shaken by the innocence of a child. And when it happened, no one would ever forget it. The judge's gavel echoed across the room, calling the court back to order. The murmurs died down, though the tension remained. The accused sat motionless, eyes lowered to the polished wood of the defense table, as though bracing himself for what was to come. To many, it felt like the trial had already been decided. The prosecutor had laid out her arguments with crisp confidence, and the jury seemed to nod in rhythm with her words. Yet the defense attorney had not played his final card. And that card came in the form of a 3-year-old child. When the judge announced that the little girl would be allowed to step forward, a ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. People leaned forward in their seats, whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Even the stenographer, whose job was to remain indifferent, raised her eyebrows slightly before returning to her typing. The mother hesitated at first, clutching her daughter's hand tightly. She whispered something reassuring, though her own voice trembled. The child, however, seemed more curious than afraid. Her wide eyes scanned the room, taking in the sea of unfamiliar faces, the tall judge with his robe, and the officers standing like statues along the walls. Holding tightly to her stuffed rabbit, the girl walked with tiny steps toward the front. Her shoes clicked lightly against the marble floor, each sound amplified in the silence. To the jury, she looked almost too small to belong in a place so serious. To some, it felt wrong. How could a child this young carry the burden of truth? But to others, there was something striking in her innocence, something unshaken by the heavy shadows of the courtroom. The judge softened his stern expression as he looked down at her. "Hello, young lady," he said gently, his voice dropping the hardness it usually carried. "Do you know why you're here today?" The girl blinked, hugged her rabbit closer, and whispered, "To help." Her answer drew a collective gasp, not because of its content, but because of the sincerity behind it. No lawyer could have scripted such a simple, piercing response. The defense attorney knelt slightly so he wouldn't tower over her. His voice was calm, almost playful, as he asked, "Do you remember being with your mommy before, when some people came to your home?" The little girl nodded, her curls bouncing. Yes, they were loud. They had a dog. The room shifted uncomfortably. A few jurors exchanged glances. Even the accused lifted his head for the first time, his eyes searching hers. The officer seated near the police dog shifted slightly in his chair, though his face remained composed. "Can you tell us what you saw?" the lawyer asked. The girl tilted her head as if trying to recall. The dog barked. Loud. The man with the dog was mean. Mommy cried. I hugged Bunny. Her words were broken, childlike, yet they carried weight. She wasn't describing a scene from a cartoon or a dream. She was describing something she had lived. The prosecutor quickly stood, objecting. Your Honor, this is inappropriate. A child of this age cannot provide reliable testimony. This is nothing but an emotional tactic. The judge paused, considering. It was true children this young were rarely, if ever, called to testify. Their memories could be fuzzy, their words easily influenced. But there was something undeniable in her tone. She was not rehearsed, not coached. Her story tumbled out raw and unpolished. I'll allow it, the judge finally said. But proceed with caution. The defense attorney nodded, turning back to the girl. And what do you see here today? Do you see the man who scared you? The girl's gaze wandered across the room. She didn't look at the accused. She didn't even glance at the jury. Instead, her eyes locked onto the officer seated with his canine partner at his side. The dog's head rested calmly on its paws, but its dark eyes were alert, scanning the room. The little girl's grip on her stuffed rabbit tightened. Her lips pressed together, as though holding back words too big for her small mouth. Then, almost without realizing it, she raised her tiny finger and pointed directly at the dog. The room froze. The air seemed to vanish. Even the clicking of the stenographer's keys halted. Bad dog, she whispered. The two words were simple. Too simple. Yet their effect was like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading rapidly outward. A few people chuckled nervously, dismissing it as childish imagination. But others, particularly the jury, leaned forward. There was something haunting about the way she said it clear, deliberate, with a certainty that didn't belong to a game or a passing thought. The officer beside the dog shifted again, clearing his throat. His jaw tightened, though his expression remained carefully controlled. The prosecutor tried to brush it off with a forced smile. Children say all sorts of things, she said to the jury, and dogs can certainly seem frightening. But the defense attorney wasn't about to let the moment pass. Sweetheart, he said softly, why is he a bad dog? The girl looked straight at the officer this time, her eyes narrowing with the focus only a child's unfiltered honesty could carry. Because he bites, when the man says. He scared Mommy. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she clutched her rabbit tightly, pressing it to her chest. The silence that followed was unbearable. The prosecutor opened her mouth to object again, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard her. More importantly, they had believed her. For the first time in the trial, the accused looked less like a criminal and more like someone wronged. The officer, once a symbol of authority, now sat under a spotlight of suspicion. The judge shifted in his seat, clearly unsettled. This wasn't part of the script, not part of the careful procedure he was used to. Something unexpected, something raw, had just been introduced into the trial, and it had come from the smallest voice in the room. The defense attorney gently thanked the child and signaled for her to return to her mother. She hopped down from the chair, clutching her rabbit, and skipped lightly back to the benches, as though she hadn't just tilted the scales of justice. Her innocence had spoken, and though many didn't yet realize it, the trial would never be the same again. The silence that followed the little girl's whisper felt louder than any sound the courtroom had ever known. Judges were used to gasps, lawyers were used to objections, and juries were used to the hum of arguments thrown across the room. But this silence? It was different. It pressed against the walls, seeped into the benches, and tightened every throat in the room. The child's tiny finger remained lifted, unwavering, aimed squarely at the German shepherd, resting obediently by the officer's side. The dog, oblivious to the sudden storm swirling around it, flicked its ears and yawned, its massive jaws opening wide before closing again with a click of teeth. "Bad dog," the girl repeated, this time with more strength, her soft voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The officer beside the animal cleared his throat. He gave a faint, strained chuckle, as though trying to defuse the moment. "Your Honor," he said, "children often mistake things." She probably remembers a TV show or some neighborhood dog that barked at her. But no one was convinced by his forced composure. His jawline tightened. The sweat at his temple glistened under the courtroom lights. The prosecutor jumped in quickly, seizing the opportunity to redirect. "Exactly, Your Honor. With all due respect, this testimony should not be given weight. It's charming, yes, but irrelevant to the matter at hand." She smiled toward the jury, trying to coax them back to her side with reason. "We must focus on facts, not the imagination of a child." The defense attorney didn't move, his gaze still fixed on the little girl. Something in the way she said those two words gnawed at him. This wasn't fantasy. Children might exaggerate, yes, but they rarely invented fear out of thin air, especially not with such clarity. "Sweetheart," he said softly, kneeling slightly so his eyes were level with hers, "can you tell us when you saw this dog before?" The girl's eyes flickered briefly toward her mother, who gave her an encouraging nod. She turned back to the attorney, gripping her rabbit tightly. "At our house. At night." He barked and barked. The man shouted. Mommy cried. Gasps rippled through the room. One of the jurors leaned forward, so abruptly his chair creaked under him. The accused man at the defense table lifted his head higher now, as though the words gave him hope. The officer with the dog shifted again. His face remained stiff, but his hands betrayed him, fingers tapping against his thigh, restless. The prosecutor stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculative and unreliable." The judge raised his hand. "Sit down, counselor. I'll decide what is admissible." His eyes lingered on the girl, then shifted to the officer and his canine. Something about the girl's description had unsettled even him. The defense attorney pressed gently. "And do you remember what the man with the dog did?" The girl hesitated, her little brow furrowed as though recalling something frightening. "He told the dog to bark. Loud. Mommy screamed. I cried. He said bad things. He scared us." Her voice trembled at the end as she buried her face against her stuffed rabbit, muffling a sob. For a moment, the courtroom ceased to feel like a place of law and order. It felt like a place of revelation. A child had peeled back the carefully painted surface of authority and shown the cracks beneath. The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat again. "She's just a child," he muttered. "Kids get things wrong all the time." But the defense attorney didn't miss the flicker of unease in his eyes. "Maybe," he said, still addressing the girl gently, "but children don't forget fear." The jury seemed to agree. Their once neutral expressions now brimmed with doubt. The scales of justice, balanced so carefully before, had tilted ever so slightly, and it wasn't in the prosecution's favor. The judge leaned forward, tapping his gavel once, not to silence, but to refocus. "The child has spoken," he said gravely. "Her words will be considered. The court will decide what weight to give them." The prosecutor's face hardened. She had felt the tide turning and didn't like it. As the little girl returned to sit beside her mother, the defense attorney straightened, his mind racing. Those 2 words, "bad dog," were not random. They were a thread, one that, if pulled, might unravel far more than anyone expected. The court resumed its rhythm, with witnesses called and documents examined, but the energy in the room had shifted. Every eye occasionally flicked back to the officer and his dog. Every whisper among the audience returned to the child's words. And the man on trial, who hours ago looked like a lost cause, now had a faint spark of possibility in his eyes. When recess was called, the courtroom burst into conversation. Reporters scribbled furiously, already imagining headlines. Child witness points at police dog, calls it bad. Spectators debated in hushed voices. Some believed the girl was simply frightened by a barking dog. Others thought she had cracked open a door no one else dared touch. The officer kept a tight grip on the dog's leash, his knuckles white. His colleagues avoided his eyes, their usual camaraderie strangely absent. The prosecutor whispered urgently with him, her words sharp, her gestures brisk. But the more she tried to dismiss the girl's words, the less convinced even her own staff seemed. The defense attorney sat at the table, scribbling notes furiously. He had something now, something real. A child's innocence had pointed directly at corruption. But it wasn't just the dog. It was the man who commanded it. If her memory could be corroborated, the entire case might collapse. Not because of clever arguments or loopholes, but because a 3-year-old had dared to speak the truth. The accused leaned closer to his lawyer. "She's telling the truth," he whispered, voice trembling. "That dog, that man, they came to my place too. They weren't there to protect anyone. They were there to make me look guilty." The attorney's eyes narrowed. The pieces were beginning to fit together. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was heavier than before. Everyone understood that the case was no longer as simple as it seemed. A 3-year-old's 2 words had cracked open a new path. And the deeper that path was explored, the closer the trial would come to an outcome no one could have predicted. What had begun as laughter at a child's remark had turned into the spark of suspicion. And suspicion, once ignited, was impossible to extinguish. The echo of the little girl's words lingered in the courtroom long after she had been led back to her mother's side. "Bad dog." 2 syllables, soft as a breath, yet they struck with the force of a hammer. The spectators whispered nervously, their eyes darting between the child, the dog, and the officer holding its leash. The German shepherd, oblivious to the drama it had sparked, lay calmly at its handler's feet. Its chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, the picture of obedience. To most, it looked like nothing more than a loyal working animal. But to the 3-year-old girl, and perhaps now to the jury, it represented something darker. The judge tapped his gavel firmly, his voice rising above the restless buzz. "Order. This court will maintain decorum. I will not tolerate disruption." His tone was sharp, but even he couldn't mask the unease that tugged at the corners of his expression. The prosecutor wasted no time. She rose from her seat, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she faced the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth but urgent, "we must not allow ourselves to be swayed by the innocent but unreliable words of a toddler. Children at that age confuse dreams with reality. They exaggerate. They misinterpret." She gestured toward the officer and his dog. "This animal is a trained canine, sworn to protect and serve. To dismiss its role because of a frightened child's memory would be an insult to justice itself." Her argument was logical, polished, almost convincing. But as she spoke, the jury's eyes betrayed doubt. They weren't looking at her, they were looking at the officer. And the officer, though he tried to sit still, could not hide his unease. He shifted in his seat. His lips pressed into a thin line. A bead of sweat traced the side of his temple. The once unshakable image of authority began to show cracks. The defense attorney stood slowly, deliberately, allowing the silence between the prosecutor's words and his own to hang heavy. When he spoke, his tone was quiet but firm. "Your Honor, with respect, children may misinterpret, but they rarely fabricate fear. A child does not invent the memory of her mother crying. A child does not point at a stranger's dog and name it as the source of terror unless she has lived it. This court cannot dismiss her words so easily." He let that sink in before continuing, his gaze sweeping across the jury. "We are here to seek truth. And truth does not always arrive in the form of documents or official statements. Sometimes it comes from the unfiltered mouth of innocence." The judge adjusted his glasses, studying the defense attorney, then the child. His gavel tapped once against the block, a sharp sound that echoed like a heartbeat. "The testimony will remain on record," he said finally. The officer stiffened, his jaw clenching. The tension rose another notch. From the benches, reporters scribbled furiously. The words "bad dog" had already etched themselves into tomorrow's headlines. Spectators whispered in hushed tones. Even the jurors shifted in their seats, the weight of suspicion settling uncomfortably on their shoulders. One juror, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense expression, couldn't take her eyes off the officer. She studied the way his fingers tightened around the dog's leash, the way he avoided looking toward the child. Another juror, a young man, scribbled notes furiously, his brows furrowed. The prosecutor, sensing her grip on the case slipping, moved to redirect. She called another witness, a neighbor who testified about the accused's suspicious behavior. But even as the testimony unfolded, the jury's attention was fractured. The shadow of the little girl's words hung over everything. The defense attorney, keenly aware of the shift, began to build on it. His cross-examination was sharp, each question designed to highlight inconsistencies. He returned again and again to one theme: intimidation. He spoke of raids conducted at night, of the fear instilled in families, of the role that police presence and their dogs played in shaping narratives. Each question seemed to circle back toward the officer and his canine partner, like a hawk circling its prey. The officer grew restless. His face flushed. His hand tightened on the leash until his knuckles turned pale. The dog, sensitive to his handler's agitation, lifted its head and glanced around the courtroom with alert eyes. A low, almost imperceptible growl rumbled in its throat before it was silenced by a sharp tug. That sound, though faint, was enough to send a shiver through the benches. Mothers pulled. The next morning, the courthouse was even more crowded than before. Word of the little girl's 2 words, "bad dog," had spread quickly. Reporters filled the steps outside, shoving microphones toward anyone willing to comment. Inside, spectators fought for seats. The atmosphere felt less like a courtroom and more like the opening night of a play everyone wanted to witness. The judge, however, wore no expression of amusement. His gavel struck 3 times, his voice sharp as he demanded order. "This is a court of law, not a theater. We will proceed with dignity." But dignity was hard to maintain when curiosity clung to every wall of the chamber. The little girl sat beside her mother again, her stuffed rabbit pressed tightly against her chest. She looked tired but unafraid, her wide eyes blinking up at the adults who whispered about her. It was strange how the smallest figure in the room had now become the most important. The defense attorney wasted no time. He called the girl back to the stand, much to the prosecutor's visible frustration. This time, however, he approached carefully. He knew children could be overwhelmed by pressure. What mattered wasn't drawing a polished testimony, but uncovering fragments of truth buried in memory. He knelt slightly to her level again. "Do you remember yesterday when you told us about the dog?" he asked softly. The girl nodded, clutching Bunny tighter. "Can you tell us more about that night? What you saw, what you heard?" The courtroom leaned forward. Even the jury seemed to hold its breath. The child scrunched her face, as though piecing together a puzzle only she could see. "It was dark. Mommy made me hide under the table. The dog barked so loud. Mommy said, 'Don't cry, don't cry,' but I did." Her little voice cracked, and she buried her face briefly into the rabbit before continuing. "The man with the dog. He yelled at Mommy. He told the dog, 'Go, go.' The dog jumped." Gasps echoed across the benches. The officer at the front stiffened, his jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck stood out. The dog, oblivious to the tension, rested with its head on its paws, panting softly. The defense attorney kept his voice calm. "Did the dog hurt you?" The girl shook her head quickly. "No, but Mommy fell. She cried." The man laughed. That detail hung in the air like smoke. A laugh. In the chaos of raids and arrests, people rarely remembered laughter. But a child did. And the image it painted was not of justice, but of cruelty. The prosecutor leapt to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These are unreliable memories from a 3-year-old child. We cannot build a case on bedtime stories." But the judge's gavel struck again. "Sit down, counselor. The jury will decide what they believe." The defense attorney nodded gratefully, then turned back to the girl. "Do you see the man who scared your mommy?" Her tiny finger lifted again, pointing without hesitation. Not at the accused, not at the jury, but at the officer with the German shepherd. The room froze for the second time in 2 days. This time, there was no chuckling dismissal, no nervous laughter, only a heavy, suffocating silence. The officer's face hardened, but a thin bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He cleared his throat, shifted in his chair, but couldn't escape the weight of her gaze. The defense attorney rose slowly, his eyes sweeping the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you just witnessed was not coached. It was not rehearsed. It was memory. Pure, raw memory. A child cannot fabricate fear like that. She remembered the dog. She remembered the man. And she remembered the terror." The jury shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at the accused with new sympathy. Others stared directly at the officer, their suspicion growing with every second. The prosecutor fought back fiercely. She reminded the jury that the accused had been found at the scene of a crime. That evidence pointed to his guilt, that children often misinterpret events. But her voice sounded strained, desperate. The courtroom could feel the tide turning. During recess, whispers filled the corridors. Some spectators spoke of neighbors who had long complained about the officer's heavy-handed tactics. Others whispered about raids that seemed staged, about people who had been frightened into silence. Reporters scribbled frantically, preparing headlines that would spark outrage. Child witness points finger at police officer. Inside the courtroom, the officer sat rigid, his hands gripping the leash of his dog so tightly his knuckles turned white. The dog whined softly, sensing its handler's tension. His colleagues, usually quick to nod or share a reassuring glance, kept their eyes down. The isolation was clear. The accused leaned toward his lawyer, whispering urgently, "She's telling the truth. That's the same dog. They used him on me too. They barked him right in my face and told me they'd let him loose if I didn't confess." The attorney's eyes narrowed. A thread had become a rope, and the rope was starting to strangle the prosecution's case. When the court reconvened, the defense attorney called for a review of the officer's past reports. The judge, though hesitant, allowed it. Files were opened, documents reviewed, and a troubling pattern began to emerge. Raids led by the same officer often included his canine partner. Arrests were made swiftly, confessions obtained quickly, but too quickly, too easily, and complaints, though buried, had been filed. The jury absorbed every detail. What once felt like a clear picture was now stained with doubt. Was the accused truly guilty? Or had the shadow of authority been misused to craft a false narrative? The child, oblivious to the storm she had unleashed, rested her head against her mother's shoulder. Her stuffed rabbit dangled loosely in her hand, its ears dragging against the bench. She was tired. To her, she had simply told the truth. To the courtroom, she had cracked open a secret buried deep within the walls of law enforcement. And once a secret is exposed, it cannot be unspoken. The accused, for the first time since the trial began, allowed himself a faint smile. Hope, fragile but real, had entered the courtroom. The officer, however, sat in silence, his future tightening around him like a noose. The jury had seen enough to wonder. The defense attorney had enough to dig deeper. And justice, once a rigid line drawn in the prosecutor's favor, was bending. All because of the fragments of memory a child refused to forget. The courthouse was no longer just a stage for legal arguments. It had become a battlefield of truth and deception. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones outstretched, cameras flashing. Overnight, the little girl's testimony had ignited a storm. Headlines screamed across morning papers. Child witness points at police, officer and courtroom drama, and 3-year-old's words shift high-profile case. Inside, the mood was different from the days before. Jurors walked in with tension visible on their faces. They weren't neutral anymore, not after the fragments of memory the child had shared. For the first time, the accused didn't look like a criminal to them. Instead, suspicion, heavy and sharp, had started to wrap itself around the officer with the K9. The judge entered, his gavel echoing across the chamber, demanding order. But the silence that followed wasn't the respectful calm of a courtroom. It was the hush of anticipation, as though everyone expected the foundations of the case to crumble. The defense attorney wasted no time. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady. Yesterday's testimony raised serious questions about the conduct of Officer Daniels and his K9 partner during raids related to this case. I formally request access to all of Officer Daniels' reports from the past year, specifically those involving the dog. The prosecutor shot up instantly. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. We cannot derail this trial to investigate a decorated officer's service record. This is nothing more than a distraction, an attempt to smear a good man." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Sit down, counselor. If there is truth to be uncovered, this court will not shy away from it." The order was given. Files were retrieved. Boxes of documents, reports, and complaints filled the front of the courtroom like a wall of paper. The officer shifted in his seat, his shoulders stiffening with every folder placed on the table. His composure cracked, if only slightly, as whispers swirled through the benches. The defense attorney flipped open the first file. His voice carried clear and deliberate as he read. Case 219. Officer Daniels, present with K9. Suspect arrested after voluntary confession. No other witnesses. Evidence minimal. Case closed. He placed the report aside and pulled another. Case 307. Officer Daniels, present with K9. Suspect confessed after initial denial. Report states, K9 intimidation used as a warning. Case closed. The jury's eyes widened. A pattern was forming, one too precise, too convenient. The prosecutor tried to interject. These are legitimate law enforcement tactics, but the attorney cut her off. Legitimate? Or coercive? Because what we are beginning to see is not protection, but intimidation. And when a 3-year-old child, with no agenda and no motive, points directly at this officer and his dog. You must ask yourselves why. The jury leaned forward, their interest sharpened. The accused sat straighter at the defense table, his expression alive with hope for the first time in weeks. The attorney continued, spreading reports across the table like a gambler laying down cards. Time after time, suspects confess when this officer and his K-9 are present. Evidence is flimsy. Witnesses are absent. And yet, the cases close neatly. Too neatly. He paused and lifted one specific file. And here, Your Honor, is the raid involving my client. Officer Daniels claims the accused confessed freely. But my client has maintained from day one that he was threatened. That this dog was used not to maintain order, but to manufacture guilt. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge struck his gavel sharply. Order. The officer's face had gone pale. He clenched his fists tightly in his lap, jaw grinding. His dog, restless, shifted on the floor, ears flicking at the rising tension. The prosecutor scrambled to recover. Your Honor, we cannot allow this circus to derail justice. These files prove nothing. They show dedicated service and results. But the defense attorney wasn't finished. He turned toward the audience, then to the jury. Service? Or corruption? Results? Or fabricated victories? This is not about smearing a good man. This is about uncovering a truth buried under the weight of authority. And that truth began with 2 words. Bad dog. The girl's words echoed in everyone's minds. Innocent. Unscripted. And now, aligned with a troubling trail of reports that painted a darker picture. The judge leaned back in his chair, expression grim. He had seen corruption cases before, but rarely had they unraveled so suddenly, so dramatically. We will recess for an internal review of these files, he said firmly. This court will not proceed until these matters are clarified. Gasps rippled again. A trial paused for investigation. It was rare, almost unthinkable. But it was happening right before their eyes. Reporters rushed out as soon as the gavel struck, eager to send updates to their editors. Spectators buzzed with excitement, disbelief, and anger. Some muttered support for the accused, others whispered condemnation of the officer. Meanwhile, the officer sat frozen, his world collapsing around him. The walls of authority that had protected him for years were cracking. He could feel the eyes of the jury burning into his skin, the stares of his colleagues heavy with unspoken judgment. The accused leaned toward his lawyer again, whispering urgently, "This is it. He did the same thing to me. He threatened me with that dog, said if I didn't confess, they'd let it tear into me. I swear it's true." The defense attorney nodded, his jaw tight. And now, the court is finally listening. In the corner, the little girl leaned against her mother, sleepy from the long day. She had no idea that her 2 words had opened a door others had tried to keep locked. To her, it was simple. The dog was bad because it scared her mommy. To everyone else, those words had become a key one that unlocked hidden corruption and shifted the weight of justice. When the court reconvened hours later, investigators confirmed what the files suggested. Complaints had been filed against Officer Daniels, alleging misconduct, threats, and coercion. Most had been buried, dismissed, or quietly closed. But now, in the light of open court, they couldn't be ignored. The prosecutor tried desperately to salvage her case, insisting the accused was guilty regardless of the officer's behavior. But her arguments fell flat. The jury wasn't listening to her anymore. Their focus had shifted entirely. The judge's face was hard as stone as he addressed the courtroom. This trial is no longer about one man alone. It is about the integrity of justice itself. And justice will not turn a blind eye to corruption. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his composure slipping further. His silence spoke louder than any words. The accused closed his eyes briefly, whispering a prayer under his breath. For the first time since his arrest, freedom no longer felt impossible. And all of it, every unraveling lie, every exposed truth, traced back to the simple, uncheckable honesty of a child who pointed at a dog and spoke the words adults had been too afraid to say. The hidden truth was out, and there was no stopping what came next. The courthouse was tense the next morning. No one whispered this time. The silence felt heavy, suffocating, like a storm pressing down before lightning strikes. Word of the internal review had spread, and the public was waiting for what would happen next. When the judge entered and struck his gavel, the echo rang through the room like a warning bell. "We resume proceedings," he declared. But even his stern voice couldn't mask the shift in atmosphere. The focus was no longer on the accused. It was fixed firmly on Officer Daniels and his dog. The officer sat at the front, rigid as stone. His canine partner rested beside him, tail thumping lightly on the wooden floor, unaware of the storm swirling around its handler. The once proud officer now looked smaller, his eyes shadowed, his lips pressed tight. The defense attorney rose smoothly. "Your Honor, yesterday revealed disturbing inconsistencies in Officer Daniels' record. Today, I request permission to cross-examine him directly." The prosecutor sprang to her feet. "Objection. This trial is about the accused, not an attack on law enforcement." But the judge's eyes cut sharply toward her. Objection overruled. If the credibility of an officer directly tied to this case is in question, this court must hear it. The jury shifted, notebooks open, pens poised. This wasn't routine anymore. This was history unfolding. Officer Daniels was called to the stand. The shuffle of his boots against the polished floor echoed too loudly in the silence. He took the oath, his voice low, his hand trembling just slightly as he swore to tell the truth. The defense attorney approached with measured steps. His voice was calm but laced with steel. "Officer Daniels, how long have you served with the department?" 14 years, Daniels replied, his tone clipped. "And how many of those years with your canine partner?" 7. The attorney nodded. "A loyal partnership. And in those 7 years, how many arrests were made with the assistance of your dog?" "Dozens," Daniels said firmly, lifting his chin. "Dozens," the attorney repeated. He paused, then picked up one of the files stacked before him. "And in those dozens of arrests, Officer Daniels, how often did the suspects confess after an encounter with your canine?" Daniels hesitated, just for a breath. But it was low enough. "Most of them," he admitted. The jury scribbled furiously. The attorney leaned closer. "Isn't it true, officer, that complaints were filed against you for using your dog to intimidate suspects?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Unfounded complaints. People will say anything when they're guilty. Unfounded? Or ignored?" The attorney's voice sharpened. He flipped open another file. Case 219. A suspect claimed you threatened to let the dog loose unless he confessed. The complaint disappeared. Case 307, same accusation. Case 344 again. 3 different people, same story. All dismissed. Why, officer? Daniels shifted in his seat, beads of sweat forming along his brow. His silence stretched too long. "Answer the question, officer," the judge ordered, his tone sharp. Daniels finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Because they were criminals. They'd say anything to get out of it." The attorney's voice sliced through the air. "Or because you abused your authority and used fear as a weapon." The words struck hard, and the officer's composure cracked. His face reddened. His fists clenched. "You don't know what it's like out there," he snapped, his voice rising. "These people, they're dangerous. You think they care about rules? You think they'd hesitate to hurt us? I did what I had to do to keep control. Gasps filled the room. The outburst wasn't just defensive, it was revealing. The defense attorney didn't flinch. So you admit to using your dog, not for protection, but for control? For intimidation? Daniels froze, realizing the trap he'd walked into. His silence screamed louder than words. The jurors exchanged looks. They weren't seeing a hero anymore. They were seeing a man who had let power twist into something darker. The attorney stepped closer, his voice quieter now, almost surgical. And on the night in question, did you order your dog to attack the accused's home? Daniel's throat worked. His hands gripped the edge of the stand. I gave the order to secure the area. Secure the area, the attorney echoed. By sending your dog into a home where a child was hiding under a table? The little girl's mother broke into quiet sobs at those words, pressing her daughter close. The child looked up, confused by the rising tension, clutching her rabbit tighter. The attorney's final question rang out clear. Tell this jury, officer, did you threaten this man's life with your dog in order to force a confession? The room went dead silent. Every eye bore into Daniel's. The weight of truth pressed down on him like chains. His lips parted, but no sound came. His shoulders slumped, his face pale. He couldn't deny it. The silence was answer enough. The judge's gavel struck hard. Order. He barked, but the damage was done. The jury had seen it. The gallery had heard it. The officer's armor had cracked wide open. The prosecutor's face was ashen. Her case was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. The accused, sitting at the defense table, felt tears sting his eyes. For weeks, he had sat branded as a criminal, his voice drowned out by authority. Now, for the first time, someone else's silence spoke louder than his own protests. During recess, the courthouse buzzed like a hive. Reporters ran to telephones, voices urgent as they relayed the breaking story. Officer Crumbles under cross-examination, the words would soon be splashed across every front page. Daniels sat alone, his colleagues avoiding him, his reputation unraveling before his eyes. His dog lay at his feet, loyal and unaware, thumping its tail against the floor. To the dog, he was still master. To the world, he was exposed. When the trial resumed, the defense attorney delivered his closing blows with precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you saw it with your own eyes. A man entrusted with authority, who used fear instead of justice. A child too young to lie pointed at him, and the truth unraveled. My client is not on trial here. Corruption is. Abuse of power is. And it cannot stand. The jurors' faces told the story. Doubt was gone. Sympathy for the accused had solidified into something stronger, belief. The judge adjourned for the day, his face heavy with thought. Tomorrow, the verdict would come. As the crowd filed out, the little girl tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, "is the bad dog going away?" Her mother kissed her forehead, tears shining in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. The bad dog won't scare us anymore." The trial wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned completely. The accused stood on the edge of freedom. The officer stood on the edge of ruin. And the truth, once whispered by a child, had thundered so loudly that no one could ignore it. The courthouse was packed to the rafters on the final day. The air was heavy, thick with expectation. People leaned forward in their seats. Reporters clutched their notepads, and cameras clicked like a chorus of crickets outside. The case that had begun as an ordinary trial had transformed into something far larger, a battle for truth, for justice, and for the soul of the system itself. The accused sat at the defense table, shoulders squared, but hands trembling. For weeks, he had lived under the weight of judgment. Today, His fate would finally be decided. Beside him, his attorney whispered words of reassurance, though even he carried tension in his eyes. The officer sat apart, no longer commanding respect. His uniform looked sharp, but his face was drawn, his eyes dull. He seemed to have aged years in days. The canine lay at his feet, loyal as ever, unaware that its handler's world was crumbling. The judge struck his gavel. The jury filed in, solemn and silent. 12 faces that had listened, watched, and weighed every word, now ready to speak. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked. The foreman stood, paper in hand. His voice was steady, but the words carried a weight that pressed down on every chest in the room. We have, Your Honor. The silence was so deep it felt fragile, as though even a cough might shatter it. The foreman cleared his throat. On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant not guilty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by a stunned hush. The accused closed his eyes, a single tear escaping down his cheek. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was free. His attorney gripped his shoulder, his voice a low whisper. It's over. But the foreman wasn't finished. Furthermore, we recommend that this court immediately review the conduct of Officer Daniels, whose actions have called into question the integrity of this case and others. The gallery erupted. Reporters rushed for the exits, eager to send headlines racing through the city. Defendant acquitted, officer under fire. The prosecutor sat frozen, her face pale, her case in ruins. The judge banged his gavel furiously. Order, order in this court. The noise subsided, though the energy in the air vibrated like a live wire. The judge turned to the defendant. You are free to go. This court apologizes for the injustice you have endured. The accused rose slowly, his knees weak, his chest rising with deep, shuddering breaths. For weeks he had been branded guilty, condemned by whispers and authority. Now, with the stroke of words, he was free. His mother wept quietly in the gallery, hands clasped together as if in prayer. But the attention quickly shifted. The judge's eyes bore into the officer. As for you, Officer Daniels, this court will open a separate inquiry into your conduct. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending investigation. The words landed like hammer blows. Daniels stiffened, his face pale. His dog nudged his leg, sensing something wrong, but the officer barely reacted. He looked like a man stripped of everything authority, respect, and certainty. The gallery whispered in shock. The invincible officer, once untouchable, was crumbling in plain sight. The little girl, perched on her mother's lap, tugged at her sleeve. Mommy, she whispered, her voice clear enough for those nearby to hear. The bad dog is going home now? Her mother hugged her close, tears slipping down her cheeks. Yes, sweetheart. The bad dog is going away. The jury members shifted uncomfortably, visibly moved. The innocence of that child's words had cut through the noise of law, evidence, and arguments. She had said what no one else dared to say. And in doing so, she had shifted the course of justice. The defense attorney, gathering his papers, paused for a moment to watch the child. He smiled faintly. Out of all the witnesses, out of all the files and arguments, it had been her, the smallest voice in the room, that carried the most weight. Outside the courthouse, a storm of cameras and reporters waited. When the accused stepped out, flanked by his attorney, cheers broke from the crowd. Strangers clapped, some shouting words of encouragement. For a man once condemned, the taste of freedom was almost overwhelming. Reporters swarmed, questions flying. How does it feel to be free? What do you think of Officer Daniels? Do you have a message for the jury? He paused, his voice rough but steady. I just want to go home, to live free, and I thank God that the truth finally came out. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels exited through a side door, flanked by colleagues who kept their distance. Reporters pounced, but his silence was deafening. No statements, no defense, just a broken figure retreating into the shadows. His dog padded beside him, tail wagging, unaware that the leash it followed might soon be cut forever. In the days that followed, the story dominated headlines. Investigations were launched into Daniel's past cases. One by one, names of those convicted under suspicious circumstances came forward. Old complaints resurfaced. The department, once quick to defend him, now scrambled to contain the damage. The little girl became an unlikely symbol of truth. Papers dubbed her the child who silenced the courtroom. Though too young to understand the impact of her words, her simple honesty had pierced through layers of fear and deception. The accused walked free, his record cleared. But freedom carried a scar. He had lost weeks of his life, his dignity battered. Yet he vowed to rebuild, stronger than before. They tried to bury me, he told a reporter quietly. But a child's voice dug me out. And as for Officer Daniels, his downfall was swift. Within weeks, he faced charges of misconduct and abuse of authority. His badge, once a shield, had become a weight dragging him down. His dog was reassigned, given to a new handler who would not wield it as a weapon of fear. The story closed where it had begun, with a child's voice. In a world where adults argued, where lies twisted truth, where power often overshadowed justice, it had been two simple words that shattered the illusion. Bad dog. Unbelievable words. Unbelievable outcome. And a reminder that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power.